Let's just get into it, shall we?
Where California. So California is a great example of a state that has done a lot on renewable energy. It has also some I think some pretty good hydroelectric resources. Not every state has those, but California's gone beyond that. Has solar, I don't know.
In California.
Yeah, so there's a lot of progress being made there. There was a lot of progress being made in Texas on renewable energy. Now that some people have falsely blamed wind for the recent weather catastrophe in Texas, we'll see if that continues. But Texas was generating at one point a quarter of its energy from wind power. And it did very little. It had very little. It didn't even have the kind of depth of like hydroelectric resources that California had. So you can do things here with state power. But what I would say though is there are two things I'm cautious about.
Real quick though, I mean, why stop there? Why stop there though? I mean, if we're talking about addressing a problem that's as big that's so big that it potentially threatens all life on Earth, why would you stop at simple measures like carbon taxes or whatnot? Yeah. Why would you not take it a step further and say, well, let's nationalize the energy industry, or let's
sure. Let's talk about that. So suppose we nationalize the oil industry and we get the United States government in the business of producing oil, presumably for some kind of revenue in exchange, perhaps even a very increasing amount of revenue. There are a couple of things I would think about that. One, to the extent that it would depend, of course, on how it's done. It's possible that the United States government could get into the oil business and do a good job of it. It's possible they do a bad job of it. But if the government gets into the oil business, you might ask why the United States government would be a responsible steward here and not a steward that would come to depend on that revenue, much in the same way that state governments have come to depend on the revenue of, say, cigarettes, which at one point, now they sell bonds on the back of, which they levy higher and higher taxes on, balance budgets in part on. I would be somewhat concerned about the notion of saying, well, we'll just have the government do all the energy, because there are different incentives there. I think it would probably be better for the government to increasingly make it more uneconomical to do polluting energy, carbon-intensive energy, first coal, eventually natural gas, incentivize nuclear, incentivize renewables, rather than to just put it all in the hands of the government. Especially because there are examples of where that has been done and is done to this day, and where the question of renewable energy, I think, is more complicated. Like a country that really starts to depend on that kind of revenue, that has a massive stake in its energy industry. Mexico, for example, is a country that has a huge stake, that its budget has come to depend on oil revenues, and as a result, it's hard to imagine that that country will just its oil industry will be phased out peaceably. And where's that money going to come from? Will people consent to higher taxes to make up for it? Perhaps, but will they consent to it for a long period of time? And that's why one of the things I would say with respect to government action is we do have to remember that we live in a democracy and we have to take government action that people are willing to sustain over different election cycles. Because if people feel as if they're giving up too much and not getting anything for it, that's, I think, where you get reactions that sort of undo the good that government can do. So I'd be cautious about,
You seem fixated on the oil part of it. I'm not talking about the entire energy industry. So hopefully, if we did something like nationalize energy in this country, seem like a half measure. Maybe they're applicable now, but there are some people that are already arguing that we're 2 decades behind or 3 decades behind in addressing this. Could you envision the problem getting so bad and the urgency increasing so much that you would be in favor of nationalizing this industry?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what you would be trying to do. Like, what would your goal be in nationalizing it? And what parts of it, since you said not the whole thing, would you want to nationalize?
Well, you would certainly want to make it more efficient, so that when you would want to invest money in maintaining the infrastructure, so that you wouldn't have a situation like what happened in Texas. But you would also redirect the focus from profit to sustainability. I don't know how realistic that is, but I'm making the argument that we could get to a point where that we have no other option. Like we have done so much damage, and we've taken our time so much in addressing this problem. Well, now it's become necessary to nationalize these industries and these companies, and then take drastic measures to reduce the carbon footprint to avoid catastrophe.
Sure. Well, so I guess there are several things I would say about that. So it might take a minute, but I will try and answer the question as thoroughly as I can. So one, the question of nationalization. Efficiency aside, right? The government can't just declare, we do this now, we own the factories, we are the only ones allowed to build, say, solar panels, and we are the only ones who will do it, and all that, right? They can't take all that stuff without paying, without compensating the owners, right? So there's a serious cost issue there, because the government, in order to nationalize in this country, has to buy everything. Perhaps they could create conditions which are so uneconomical along the way that the company would sell at rock bottom prices, but even that could arguably be seen constitutionally, under our constitution, as a kind of taking that would have to be compensated. So that's one thing, right? If you're going to nationalize in this country, you can't just do it like perhaps in some countries where you can do it for free. The government is going to have to lay out a lot of money to do that. So that's one thing. Yeah. Two, it is also important to remember that the United States, for all its wealth and economic influence and pollution, is only about 15% of carbon emissions worldwide. So before the United States...
Highest per capita.
Yeah, highest per capita for sure. But again, 15%. If the United States disappeared tomorrow, and nothing else changes in the world, I mean, you've still got 85% of your problem there. So it's not to say that the United States shouldn't do things, but it is to say that
we're also a global leader, though. So like, other countries take our example and then reflect those policies in their own countries.
Yes. And so what we should do is, before I think we take an action like, say, buying the entire, or the federal government nationalizing the entire energy industry, we should look toward one, whether we can continue to subsidize production of renewables, continue to tax and otherwise, regulate, punish production of, alternatives, for one. And two, work with countries overseas, around the world, to create binding targets for carbon emissions. Because without binding international targets, it seems very difficult to imagine selling these very deep cuts in carbon emissions domestically. For example, if we do carbon taxes on our own, and they're really high, right? They're not, it's not 2 or 3%, some really high amount that really does start to punish people who are rolling coal, punish power plants that are still, running dirty energy, and on and on and on, right? If we do that, and that increases the cost of living for people, I think they'll be prepared to do that for at least some period of time. But as that kind of cost continues to accumulate, one, people who are able to pick up and move to other countries to engage in the same kind of, economic activity, if there's some kind of production that's very carbon intensive, will consider doing that. And two, I think voters will start to wonder, why are we doing this if we don't have, if we're not doing this in tandem with others?
Well,
so that's a big thing.
It couldn't work unless there were lateral opportunities for the people that were working in these industries. It couldn't work. You would lose. Democrats would lose every state that they need to win. So I'm not proposing something like nationalizing the energy industry in the absence of training programs, compensation, jobs in lateral renewable energy industries. It simply couldn't work without. I agree with you. Like you couldn't just disrupt this industry like that and then expect not to pay a serious political price for doing so. All the work would be undone 4 years later, 6 years later. Yeah, like the example of that really comes to mind is President Obama's Clean Power Plan, which, the first and foremost problem with that was that they tried to do it through regulation alone. There was no additional legislation, and so that made it harder to get the legal foundation to be able to do this big program of saying, states have to meet certain targets for how much energy they generate from certain sources. And then once President Trump took office, because that was, because there was no legislation, people tried to challenge it in court and say, this isn't what the law was intended to do. This was a law about air quality, not about renewable energy. So they tried to challenge it like that. And then once President Trump took office, he just wiped it out because it was all administratively done. So
yeah, I think you're right that it's important to think about how to do this stuff over the long term. And I agree that it's you need to take serious action very quickly. But it seems to me then that if that's the case, then we should look at what the United States is already doing, where we're already building renewable energy, where we're already making progress on reducing emissions, where we can have the best bang for our buck, and then try and do as much in that sense as possible, rather than say, taking an all new approach. Because as far as, and I'll have to look this up to double check, as far as I know, we are getting more production now for similar amounts of carbon emissions than we were in the past. The United States' carbon emissions have been relatively flat since 2005, and that's been with relatively little state action, primarily the replacement of coal with natural gas. The United States, though, during this time has done nothing really in terms of complying with international agreements. The Paris Accord that we pushed during the Obama years that President Trump shredded. I think we've still made some progress. Well, I can't say that for sure, but the Kyoto Accords, we made progress on that despite not really trying because of just changes and from coal to natural gas alone.
Well, when we signed the Paris Accords, there was a provision in the agreement that said that it was basically the U.S. couldn't pull out until 2020. So it was basically, it was a safeguard to make sure that the next president who came in didn't just rip that up. Like he tried to. He announced that we were going to leave the Paris Accords, but we were still locked in through the time that Biden was inaugurated, and then he announced that we were going to stay in. So just a small aside.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so it's I would say that subsidize, raise taxes to pay for these programs of increased subsidies, work with other countries to come up with, again, binding targets. Binding is a hard thing to do internationally, but nevertheless, that's something we should look at. And I think that it's important to do all of this because we still, at the end of the day, live in a democracy, and what we do has to be able to get through the electoral process. Because if we I'm not saying that this is what you're proposing or that this is what anyone on the left is proposing in particular, but if we just say, look, we've got to do whatever it takes, and we say the economic outcomes be damned, well, they'll be damned for a few years, but I don't know that it's hard to envision, at least in the near term, what could happen that would outweigh any kind of serious economic damage. If we're taking economic damage, we're not getting progress with multilateral agreements to control carbon. It's hard for me to imagine that we can sustain serious environmental programs, like we're talking about here, through multiple election cycles. That's what we got to do, right?
So just to clarify your overall position, you're obviously a big free market guy. Avoid regulation when you can. I think you're pro union, right? You seem like a pretty pro union person.
Sort of like, I guess. Let me just say a bit about the regulation, the free market, and all that.
Okay.
I acknowledge that not everything can be done in a way that leads to best outcomes through markets. And there's a real big free market guy, Friedrich Hayek, who said something to the effect of, and he was from the Austrian School of Economics. He's super libertarian. He nevertheless said in a real good essay that, look, government at the end of the day is the most benevolent and magnificent institution of them all because it's the one that makes all the others possible, right? Mm-hmm. Which is to say, even if you say free markets, you still need government to do some things. You still need government for courts, at least for police, for military, at least. Those are the three things that almost everybody agrees on, almost everybody, right? So almost everybody acknowledges that you need a state for some big things. I and other people who are part of this neoliberal project group that I affiliate with say that we need the government to do more. For example, it seems like there are some industries that, because of their unique characteristics, it seems like if you want to get good outcomes, the government has to get seriously involved. One of those seems to be healthcare. There are 24 countries that have very effective universal healthcare systems, and the United States is not one of those countries, really. I mean, our biggest problem is cost, but we also have middling outcomes for the amount of money we spend compared to countries like, say, Germany or Taiwan or the Netherlands or on and on and on, right? So it seems like Right? If you're taking an empirical approach, that's the way to go. Look at how those countries are doing it. Markets are not the 100% solution there. But sometimes with other products, with most products, yeah, markets work A-okay. So it depends on what we're talking about and what the unique characteristics are. And then sometimes we can make a case and say, you know what, hey, the government needs to have a more active role here.
Okay. Well, I mean, we'd have to go into more detail. I'm just naturally, when I came of age, I really binged a lot of Chomsky and Zinn, and there's this movie called The Corporation. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's like a 3-hour documentary where they talk about, was it the 13th Amendment that corporations were using to establish legal personhood? And they talked about how, okay, well, if a corporation is a person, what kind of person would they be? And so they go through the DSM and they diagnose corporations as a psychopath. And they go through each characteristic, and corporations fit every single one of them.
Go
and
figure.
So I mean, like that was just my exposure to those kinds of ideas and that kind of literature and that kind of media back then.
You talk about corporate personhood. I know I didn't answer your question about unions either, so I'm happy to talk about both of those.
Well, yeah. I suppose get into it. I want to get into the mind of a neoliberal and see where I line up here.
So first of all, as far as unions go, I'm not like pro or anti, really. I acknowledge that they have as much right to exist as corporations themselves, in the sense that they are voluntary organizations that people get together and form to bargain for better wages and conditions and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, I'm not a labor law expert, so I can't speak to the particulars of, say, the federal law informing a union and all that. But when you think about something like a right to work law, and California doesn't have these.
No, they do. They do.
Really? A right to work law? Holy moly!
Okay. So the right to work law, is that the one where? Okay, so I remember I got a job working at a restaurant, and I had to sign a waiver saying they could fire me for any reason whatsoever, and it's okay because I signed this waiver. I don't know if that is what the right to work law is. I might be mixing it up with something else. Then.
So that just sounds like at-will employment.
That's what I'm thinking.
Actually, I didn't think they had that. I thought California was one of the exceptions to that too, but I guess not.
This was over 10 years ago. It might have changed, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. But several states, about 20, somewhere between 20 and 30, have what are called right to work laws. And what that means is that say you're negotiating, and I know sometimes it's not really much of a negotiation, but when you're taking a job with the company says, okay, we're going to pay you, and we're going to pay you this much to show up for this many hours, whatever. And you are then told by the company also, you have to, as a condition of your employment, be a part of this union that has come to an agreement with us that everybody who works for our company is going to be part of a union, right? In a state without a right to work law, that is a possibility because the company can have come to an arrangement with the union ahead of time, right, through negotiation, and the employee is told, look, join union or you work somewhere else, right? Mm-hmm. So that's that and it's typically conservatives who push right to work laws, when they say, quote, right to work, what they mean is they want to ban that kind of agreement between unions and companies. Right. And while in a sense that makes the employee somewhat freer in a sense, it really is, to me, a violation of the basic right to contract of the union and the company. And if the union and the company want to come to terms and say, look, you want to work at our company, you got to be part of this union, that's up to them. And we know that right to work states have reduced wages, reduced outcomes, and it's not exactly earth-shaking in terms of differences, I think, but it's still it's a serious difference. So that's the kind of anti-union law that I would like to get rid of. It seems like it just violates people's freedom of contract, and in exchange, it puts a thumb of government on the side of business. And that's not, business already has plenty of bargaining power. It doesn't need the government to come in on its side in that fashion. So I'm not pro-union in the sense that I think the unions need a lot of favorable rules, but certainly we should take all the anti-union rules and get rid of those. So would you think that everybody would belong to a union where it was applicable? I mean, obviously it doesn't work if you're self-employed or a contractor or something like that, but if you're working for a big company, small company,
Do you think that, I mean, when you look at the favorable outcomes of unionhood, when you talk about better benefits, better wages on average, I think they make on average 11 or 13% more, something like that, definitely have better benefits. There's a social utility there, a very obvious social utility. I mean, it's in the better interest of the people of the country that people can better support themselves and have access to healthcare, that kind of thing. So I guess I'm wondering in what circumstances would you oppose unions? I mean, we talk about like police unions. Sometimes they can be destructive or whatever, but
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, police unions are sort of unique, and I think public sector unions generally are kind of unique because the relationship between government and the taxpayer is sort of different, I think, between, say, government or between a private company and its customers. There's not really an alternative to the government and to the police, and so the idea of, say, the police going out on strike, I mean, that's a very strange thing to imagine. I mean, then why? Like, it sounds like you would propose then that every business is, somebody, like some kind of government like mandate for unions, that somebody has to form a union, right? Somebody, like, if you're running a company of a certain size, you have to have a union of some kind. And if people aren't organically forming them, perhaps the company has to provide them one or something, like somehow, right? And it just seems like if you're willing to deploy that much state power, like, why wouldn't you just then look at whatever the benefits are and just have the government, again, assuming we have the ability to do either.
It's not just benefits though.
Right.
It's like the amount of hours that you work, what kind of overtime pay you get. It's the benefit. If we could get government subsidized healthcare, that obviously would mitigate that problem entirely, and so we wouldn't even have to have that discussion. But as far as like future wage hikes go and vacation pay, I mean, there's all kinds of issues that I would be okay with some kind of state enforced union mandate, just because my interest is to see the people's quality of life, working class quality of life, greatly increase in this country. Because where it's at right now, I mean, I am afraid of some kind of violent revolution in the future if we allow the problem of income inequality and flattened wages to continue for another decade or two. I mean, we're setting ourselves up for if we thought that we experienced social unrest, at like the turn of the century with like labor struggles, and then also just in the last decade, how disruptive that's been. I'm afraid of what could happen, a decade or two from now if some demagogue takes power, and we saw like a hint of that with Trump, where he tried to tap into that populism a little bit, and he was quite effective at it.
I agree. Like, well, I agree, not in your solution, but I agree with the idea of this is a thing to be aware of, this rise of kind of populist sentiment. And of course, I mean, some of you, I did this meme a few months ago where I pretended to, scalp some PS5s or whatever. And, people are just like, I'm going to cut your fucking head off, Bastiat. This guy got banned from Twitter now twice for it. So it's, there's a lot of, certainly, I'm a stranger to people talking about shot my head off, but I guess
scalpers get the wall and whatnot.
Scalpers get the wall, right? Screw that. It's a fucking toy, right? And it's a fun toy, but you know what? I didn't actually scalp these 13 PS5s. I just posted a picture of it from Reddit, and I thought it was funny. But once people really started going off about it, I was like, well, hell, I can't just say I was kidding. Then I got to double down. But to talk really about like
isn't this though the perfect example of like the coconut on the island situation? Isn't that like the perfect real world scenario? If you have a limited resource like a PS5, and then you have people with the means to thousands of dollars that they can then use to spend money and then sell those at massive profit and then exploit other like working class people to like get a couple $100.
Yeah, sure. And that's the thing. All right, let me tell you about some of my customers who didn't actually exist. But all right, let's talk about some of them.
Okay.
Right? Not everybody has the ability to sit there at 12:01 a.m. and repeatedly click on Walmart.com to get that one PS5. Right? But what about Hutch? What about the family man? All right. What about the family man who works long hours? All right. And he just wanted to get a PS5 for his daughter who he loves so much. She wanted that PS5 and he was willing to pay me $700 for one that he couldn't have got for $500.
At the low cost of like a 50% markup. For what is your labor, sir? Your labor is clicking a couple buttons at the right time because you had enough money in your bank account.
So what, Hutch? I'm connecting him with something he otherwise wouldn't be able to get. What's his alternative in this situation? Because keep in mind, the alternative you've described is he doesn't get a PS5 at all.
The alternative is that if you had less scalpers, and you would have people like this customer of yours would have been able to purchase a PS5 to begin with.
I'm not a PS5 expert here, but I will say that as far as I know, it isn't the scalpers that made it so that there's just no supply of them. It's a fact that
there have been supply.
Like a severe chip shortage, and for some reason, I guess we have real problems producing chips, and they're all made in Taiwan. And there's a lot of expertise goes on, or something. Just some shortage. Sony doesn't price the consoles, I guess, on their own for a variety of reasons. It seems like consoles are kind of a loss leader. They want people to spend money on the games and the internet connectivity services and less on the console, but it seems like Sony just doesn't have enough supply, right? And there's also, I suppose, the argument of, Sony maybe wants to cut down on warehousing, rather than have these just kind of, but I guess the bigger point is, though, that even in a situation like that, that's sort of ridiculous, you're still connecting people who want a product who otherwise couldn't get it with a product that you've got available for them. The company that produces the product is made whole, right? The people who want the product clearly want enough to pay for it, and it's a luxury good that, it's a luxury good.
I don't think we agree on this one. I don't think we're ever going to agree on this one.
I mean, I guess what I would say is with something like this, it's one thing to say, look, we need to have a society where, we ensure that everybody has healthcare. And, because that's not a luxury good, right? We need that. What's the price you would pay to not die? right? That's a very different question than what is the price you would pay to provide a PS5 to Bastiat's fake, theoretical daughter in the situation, right?
Mhm.
And in healthcare, I can make a very clear argument and say, look, there are examples, all right, of where we have policies that work in other countries that work great, in the Netherlands, where they don't even get rid of, private healthcare completely, right? They just have very active government involvement to ensure universal available service at affordable prices. And healthcare is a unique good, and that's cool. But with some other things, like say the PlayStation, to say, well, the government should step in and ensure that you can't overcharge, you can't resell, what exactly is the social good achieved? What is the purpose, and what are some of the costs?
Maybe you could have some kind of regulation to put a cap on like how much you can resell these things for, but I don't know how effective that would be if people are just exchanging cash and they're not reporting it to the IRS at the end of the year.
You just gotta ask, for what purpose compared to some of the things
that right there. Yep.
Really, I think could and should do. Because I agree there are some things government should do and should be more actively involved in, but I don't think that government has a case to get involved in everything. So
yeah, I mean, I guess I'm speaking more from like an idealistic point of view. I can't see a practical government solution to the scalping.
I do want to ask you about that.
I don't spend a lot of time and energy on things that I don't see a practical.
I would challenge your idealism on that. I mean, I believe you were talking about the police earlier.
Yeah.
Would you really want to put a person in another situation where they might face contact with the police because they resold a PS5? I mean, because ultimately, of course, all laws have to be enforced in some capacity by the government.
Well, I mean, I don't know how involved the law enforcement.
Well, that's not
would
true,
be.
though.
Like,
I mean, we have civil suits.
Unless you had to do these sorts of transactions in like a specific location where there were witnesses there to like make sure that the transaction was done properly. But I'm not suggesting that.
I mean, would you be willing to have the police enforce these laws? At some point, if they don't, then they exist, but they're just not respected, which itself sort of undermines, respect for the law generally.
Well, I think in this scenario, I don't think it would be like the enforcement of it would come in the form of a police officer showing up at your house. It would be like other government agencies that are like watchdog groups or whatever. But again, I don't want to go down too far down this rabbit hole because I'm not seriously suggesting that kind of law. I just don't. It's hard for me to see the usefulness in the same sort of the same way that you do when it comes to scalping. When you talk about these people as if they're providing this invaluable service,
that's not what it's about. Yeah, it's about trying to make money.
Yeah, I think of like the 20 people that were refreshing the Target page trying to get their PS5, and then they got fucked because somebody bought 20 and then sold it for 100% markup or whatever they're selling it for. I'm sure there were people selling PS5s for $1,000, $2,000. I mean, I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me. That's just how these console launches go. If you wanted to talk about the police situation, I'm curious to hear what your thoughts were. I mean, my big thing that I was getting into it with my chat about was the fact that I agree. I think most reasonable people in this country agrees that there are overarching problems with law enforcement that have gone on for decades that need to be reformed or remedied in some fashion. Where I diverge from some of the people in my chat is that I think that messaging is incredibly important.
I remember we were both in on an issue like this a few months ago with the Frederick Douglass, I think, tweet about somebody saying,
I don't remember that.
Sorry, I said something to the effect of Frederick Douglass was very, messaging matters. Here's an example of Frederick Douglass giving a speech where he says, "Hey guys, messaging matters."
Okay, yes, right, yeah, I do remember that. Okay, yeah. So that's
Sorry to cut you off there.
No, go ahead, jump in at any time. But that was the point that I was making, was that there need to be clear goals, and there need to be there needs to be a logical strategy to accomplish those goals. And I think, unfortunately, right now, in periods of social unrest, and I'm not even like blaming people for being angry. Like the fact that people are angry in the streets, sometimes rioting, sometimes looting, sometimes committing acts of violence. I think that while we should focus on those things and try to minimize those occurrences as much as we possibly can,
Fortnite,
it makes way
hello.
more sense to focus on the problem that is
How are you?
That is incensing these mobs. to begin with. And the way that you do that is through like
Guild
I said,
game
clear
indeed, by
goals.
the way.
And the messaging side of that, I can't even stress how important messaging is. I mean, like it's the soul of
You can
politics.
sue
It's
anyone
the
for
reason
anything you
why,
want.
Slogans win and lose elections all the
Doesn't
time.
mean you're going to win.
Or they're the death of legislation, or they're the birth of legislation.
No.
Depending on how you frame what your goal is. And
Generally
unfortunately
speaking,
right
no.
now, I think it's only like 15% of the country want to like abolish the police, and the highest it ever got was maybe like 30% at the height of the protests in
Yeah,
June.
sorry to break the
And
news to you.
The overwhelming majority of black people in this country don't want to abolish the police. and
Who called you
yet
an idiot?
there are
I'll
so
come
many
after
people-
him.
There are so many people on social media that are really committed to that slogan. They don't care if
Again,
you
we're not
somebody
gonna
up with a
win,
different slogan
but we
that
might be able to
accomplishes the
spook 'em,
exact same
huh?
thing. Their position is
Make 'em
I'm not
spend a
gonna
little
change
bit
the
of
slogan,
time
I
and
shouldn't
money.
have to fuck you, you fucking shit lib. And that's just kind of how some of these people operate. And
Defamation
I find that
cases
to
are
be
really,
quite
really hard.
productive.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, it's well, it depends on what your goal is. I mean, your goal is to do something that's counterproductive. If,
Also,
on the
how's
other
your day
hand,
going?
Your goal is to sell Patreon subscriptions for the Amped Up podcast with Ryan Knight. Well, I mean, that's actually probably a pretty effective strategy. I don't recall what he had to say about the police in particular, but he's
How
just
many patrons does he have? Is he just killing it over
not
there?
too many, really. He posted this recently. He's just the one who comes to mind because he had these very, something about, you can be a comrade for my Patreon, you can be a member of the Politburo, whatever. Just very transparently performative nonsense. And it's he's also kind of famous for going from Elizabeth Warren to Lenin in the course of like less than a year.
Yeah.
So
I find that guy to be quite insufferable.
But that being said, I shouldn't. Apologies to you, Ryan, if you're listening. I shouldn't be focusing so much on you. It's this is not just him, and he's certainly not the biggest one. But the issue generally of the police, I guess I would say, is this. It seems to me that in this country we have a situation where the police. We don't have robust accountability mechanisms and for the police and for prosecutors, and yet we have
opposite.
very
Nice.
strong protections for police and for prosecutors. And I mentioned prosecutors as well, of course, because the police bring them in, and the prosecutors are the ones who put them in prison for very long periods of time, right? That prosecutors, they sit in jail for a while, but unless they are given a very coercive plea bargain. And I know my use of the word. Viciously. I will make an example of you, in fact. I was talking to a guy named Clark Neely on stream a couple of weeks ago, and he's the vice president for criminal justice at the Cato Institute, and they're a libertarian group. So, make of it what you will, but libertarians are usually pretty good on criminal justice issues because they don't think drugs should be illegal, and they don't really like the police. Or it depends on the ones you're talking to, of course, because there's like Liberty Hangout with Caitlin Bennett, where that brand of liberty is, fascism. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, folks like the folks at Cato, I think, are pretty strong in criminal justice. And he was telling me all these horror stories because he's fought governments on these issues before. He's a big time attorney, and he was telling me about how prosecutors can engage in that kind of activity. How the 95% of cases are pled out. That is to say that you never go to trial, and when you're dealing with plea bargains, which judges are very quick to approve of, when you're dealing with plea bargains, you're dealing with a situation where people may agree to just about anything for the sake of avoiding a very serious possible sentence, for the sake of getting home with their families, whatever, right?
Wait a second, though. How does this not apply to your conversation with Vosh about coercive wages?
Yeah. Well, here's, I think, the difference.
Okay.
And this isn't, and I'm not, by the way, saying that there's, all I will acknowledge for the purpose of this discussion that there are differences between types of coercion, right?
Okay. Right.
But there is no question that when the government says, do X or I will use force, that's coercion by any metric. Any metric. It is not intrinsic. It is, or is not extrinsic. It is not merely a question of exploitation. It is a question of force. Do what I say, or I will use the police to lock you in a cell in a cage for years. Right. So that's clear coercion, as opposed to saying, for example, look, you have to take this job, or I won't pay you this money. Right. That's not good.
If we're talking about
but that also is not locked in a cage by state force. So that's the point I was trying to bring out. There are differences in what you're getting at there.
I suppose.
And if you view that as the same, then you're sort of, I think, depriving the term of much meaning, because we've got to recognize the different gradations and what is force, what is violence, right?
Well, I mean, sure. There's a spectrum, you could say, of coercion that we can talk about different examples of it. But if you're talking about state force as a destructive force, and you're saying this is bad because it's destructive, it does harm, then it's hard for me to understand how you can't see like loss of wages as a similar destructive force, because that's almost like a force. That's almost like a form of violence, like withholding somebody's wages unless they agree to substandard salary. What's that person? How they're going to feed themselves? I mean, their body is going to have a violent reaction to starving. So
is withholding labor a form of violence then?
Can you explain that a little bit? What do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, the labor, resources, withholding something that someone needs. I mean, because it seems like, by the standard you're setting, again, I would acknowledge that there are, I don't want to lose my wage. That's not a good thing. I get that. But the standard you're setting where that could be violence, I mean, is going on a strike, like, for example, suppose you go on strike, right? And it doesn't work. The company folds, the boss leaves. I mean, did you commit violence against a fellow employee? It seems like what you're doing is you're very, very, it just seems like a definition that sort of limits the range of action you can take. Like, if I cut you for the sake of saving the company, right? I mean, did I commit violence, or did I respond to economic forces?
Well, let me just ask you. What's the usefulness of a company that pays substandard wages?
From a moral standpoint, perhaps. Also, not to say that the
it depends on what the alternative is.
The violence is not in the name of greater moral good.
I guess there's one benefit to whoever's consuming the product that is cheaper than it would otherwise be. But beyond that, what is the alternative for the person here in the situation, right? If the alternative is that getting rid of this company leads to, I guess, another company hiring them for more money, then okay, sure. But why wouldn't then that person just go work for that company then? When you say what value are they providing? They're certainly providing some value. It just seems like rather than saying they're not providing value to society, we agree that we want to have some kind of policy situation where nobody in this country makes less than whatever wage. It just seems like the question is not. And the question is how we get there versus a company that pays substandard wages has no right to exist. Perhaps you believe that, but what good does it do to destroy that company for the person who works for it?
Well, I don't know if I would put it in those terms, in terms of whether or not they have a right to exist. Certainly they have a right to exist under our current legal
I don't mean to
economic
put
framework.
words in your mouth. That's just kind of one of the arguments I've heard. But.
That exists. I mean, and certainly some perks would be cheaper commodities. So affordable iPhones. That's one of the reasons why we can afford these things, is because these companies are paying substandard wages. But if you could snap your fingers and make it so that everybody in the world was making enough money to support themselves and potentially a small family or something like that, would you do that? I think probably you would, but maybe where you and I disagree is the methods by which to get there. And I think this is I really appreciated the fact that during the end of the debate with the debate you had with Vosh, you stressed the point that you guys are basically allies, and I think both of you acknowledged that, and I appreciated that a lot. But you talked about how you both have very similar goals. You just have very different visions for how to get there, and that seems to be the case.
I agree with that. Although I will say, I left that debate thinking, where exactly is the socialism here? Because if socialism means we will do co-ops by force if we have done a study and several studies conclude that this would be a good thing to do. Okay, I mean, it seems a little. I was a little curious about his politics at that point. But what I was trying to express there was like, look, if right now at this particular political moment, it's not. There is relatively minimal risk of the workers rising up and seizing the means of production. However, there is a pretty well demonstrated risk of right-wing authoritarians seizing government. Yeah. And so, that I think I was trying to kind of drive home that, on the issues of the now, certainly I think we agree more than we disagree. Well, but in the long term, less so.
I don't see that the kind of revolution that's the sort of like the Twitter tankies are talking about. I don't see that as possible probably in my lifetime. And so it can be fun to have these sort of philosophical discussions about what's the best way to accomplish our goals or what our goals are and et cetera, but I try not to spend too much time like getting into the weeds about that stuff because I'd rather focus on, well, what is the system that we're in right now and like what is the best way to reform the system to improve the quality of life for as many people as humanly possible. So I'm really big into pragmatism at the age of 37. I think I might have been one of those obnoxious Twitter people at the age of 20. I do think that's very possible, if not likely. And I think just seeing, getting more experience with seeing how politics and commerce operate in this country over the last 2 decades, I've just come to recognize these things as things that exist and things that will continue to exist for years and decades to come. And so my focus is, how can we use the state to improve people's quality of life? And you kind of like, you seem to sort of cringe a little bit at the idea of like a threat of state violence or whatever, but I guess I just don't have the same take on that one. I'm not imagining like a group of like, socialist police officers like kicking down the doors of Coca-Cola with batons and like beating executives until they pay their workers better. I don't think it necessarily needs to go down that sort of violent rabbit hole. I don't know where you're where are these concerns coming from? Do you have like historical references?
Well, I guess it depends on what you're talking about. Like if you're saying just raise the minimum wage by a few dollars, then that most companies will react simply by.
What about $15?
Yeah, I mean, from what I saw, the research on the $15 minimum wage was that it would depress future hiring in some capacity. It would have some effect on existing employment. And of course, it's marginal, but I mean, you did describe the loss of somebody's income as a form of violence. It's certainly not marginal for the people who face it, for what it's worth. And the only source I have on hand here is the CBO report that said it would pull, I think, 1.3. I shouldn't say this for sure. I don't know how many people would pull out of poverty. I want to say 1.3 million, and it would lead to 1.3 million fewer people working, but I may be misquoting that. What I do want to say though is that would result in businesses. Some businesses would close. Probably larger businesses would grow, and smaller businesses would wilt accordingly. But that is what it is. That's just taking an existing policy and ratcheting it up a little bit. And I think most businesses would probably just do that, and customers would pay a little bit more. There'd be some fewer jobs created, and that would be, that is sort of, I guess the quote unquote harm in that situation. I shouldn't say quote unquote, it is harm in a sense, comes in the form of those future jobs that are not created because
definitely,
it's harder, it's more expensive to hire people. How do we see that? Do those jobs hurt?
How many of those
jobs? How can we ever count them?
How many of those jobs would have gone to people that already had another minimum wage job? I mean, that's another interesting data point that probably would need a little bit more clarity on. But I assume that many. I know, like I worked minimum wage jobs when I was a lot younger, and the people that I worked with probably, like, this is just a guess, but probably like 50 to 75% of people that worked at this Burger King that I worked at also had another job elsewhere. So if we lose, 1 million jobs or whatever the CBO projected, obviously, it wouldn't. I wouldn't be happy unless the people that actually lost jobs, I wouldn't be like super thrilled unless we had a strong welfare state, strong enough to support these people while they were transitioning into a different kind of job. So it's not like I envision just raise the minimum wage and just let the market just do its thing. It would have to be accompanied by strong social safety nets as well.
I guess this is the big difference for me with that approach, is that what I would want to do with these free markets is I would like to say, all right, we know they generate a lot of wealth and a lot of income and a lot of resources, and they are typically more effective, when it comes to things like production than, say, a very tightly regulated or a very government-controlled industry. What I would like to do is, if we have a social objective we want to achieve, like say we want better healthcare or we want higher wages, then I would rather than just say, okay, we will wave the magic wand and every business must pay $15 an hour. We would tax and then we would redistribute. So we would, rather than try and force the creation of unions that would lead to better health negotiations, we would just waive we would tax and redistribute on health. We would tax and redistribute on wage supplements or subsidies or whatever, instead of trying to force a business to do X, Y, or Z, because there are a couple of issues with that generally that I can see. If there's a health and safety regulation, that's something different. But if we're trying to achieve economic outcomes, it seems like redistribution of taxed revenue is the better way to go to ensure that we don't result in unintended outcomes like job losses, like say, a policy like $15 would hurt jobs in Mississippi a lot more than would hurt jobs in like New York. Instead of those outcomes, why wouldn't we just want to tax, especially the rich, and redistribute to whatever our goal is? And we know that policies like that work.
So are you? I assume you're a fan of Biden's child allowance, the child tax credit, the expansion of that. Yeah,
right now I think that I'm not up to snuff on all of Biden's ideas, and I suppose my ideal welfare would be the provision of a few services like healthcare through government, and then some kind of massive cash transfer, monthly or whatever. I would prefer to give people the freedom to take those resources and use them as they see fit. Some people would make bad decisions, but some people would make very good decisions.
That is Biden. That's Biden's plan.
Yes, his is a good example of moving in that direction. So yeah, that seems good. I don't know about the particular numbers compared to, say, Mitt Romney and Michael Bennett had some other proposal, sort of like that.
It was similar-ish. I think Biden's goes a little bit further, but it was similar. Mm-hmm. It was surprising to see coming from someone like Romney.
Yeah. So it's been that was also surprising. Although Mitt Romney, who knows what's going through his mind after his colleagues basically had him chased out of the Capitol.
Right. So seeing him march with a Black Lives Matter mask was.
That was a trip, man.
What fucking timeline am I in right now?
Right.
Yeah, no, I'm not opposed to like if we could do that, right? Like focus on taxation and redistribution that way rather than put pressure on companies to as long as you showed me data that showed like, okay, well, doing this policy lifted, this many people out of poverty or made sure that nobody lived in poverty or something. Ideally, that'd be great. Then I wouldn't be opposed to that. I mean, like I'm into whatever works. So if your approach works, then sure, I'm not closed off to that at all.
Well, I think it's important just at least to think about because I get what you're saying. Like we want better outcomes for workers, and I agree with that. And I think there's a pretty self-interested case for that to be made because, as you explained earlier, there are a lot of people who are frustrated, rightly or wrongly, with the current, I guess the way things are at the moment in the United States. Mm-hmm. I don't think all of that is reasonable. I think there are a lot of people who believe things like, say, immigrants are taking their jobs or that the country as a whole has become poor from trade. I don't think either of those are usually true. But either way, people are feeling, there's this populist moment, and some of it has subsided without Trump. But of course, we've had populist moments in the past too, and they always seem to lead to very, very dangerous outcomes. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that the government should take actions to address basically improve people's lives. I think that's important to do, even from a self-interested perspective, even if you don't really care, even if you just want the best outcome for yourself. I think that you should be pulling for things like child tax credits and some of the other COVID relief, the infrastructure bill. I mean, I don't know everything that's in the infrastructure bill. I know there's some questions about whether it's infrastructure or not, but ultimately it seems like
It's pretty girthy proposition. Let's see. Can they do reconciliation again at the end of the year? Or do they have to wait until 2021? Oh, I'm sorry, 2022.
I don't know about the timeline. I know that it has to be something that's related to
the federal budget.
Something related to the budget. I don't know about the timeline.
Up to 10 years. I don't think it can. The effect of it can go beyond 10 years. I think is what I read about.
Oh wow.
Reconciliation. Yeah. So.
I don't know. Yeah. I'm sure they'll try, but it's I mean, it seems like right now we have hit a moment in history where inflation is pretty well under control. And while that is the case, if that changes, then what the government should be doing, I think, should change perhaps accordingly. But right now, it seems very difficult to push inflation up. And so if the government therefore wants to borrow more and spend more, now with very low interest rates, it seems like the time to do that.
I think there was some kind of report that came out today, some kind of government report that came out today about inflation that showed a pretty high rate of inflation. But what I was reading from, I read some article from an economist. They were talking about how it's expected after the year that we just had to see a short spike in inflation because we saw prices going down last year because of the economy kind of floundering a little bit. So that's just sort of an aside. Do you view people like is his name Ryan Knight, Proud Socialist? Is that his name?
Yeah, and he's just a Twitter memer. I don't mean to single him out in particular. He's just the most recent one I kind of squabbled with.
Well, I consider him a problem, but do you consider people like him, or do you consider people like Hassan, or do you consider people like Bernie Sanders, Breonna Joy Gray? Do you consider them to be allies?
I guess it depends on the issue, right? Like in the sense of, opposed to Trump and, Josh Hawley, maybe, if he makes him run the White House, opposed to the MAGA movement, then sure, yeah. Beyond that, though, I mean, three of those people are entertainers, and then there's Bernie Sanders. And there's nothing wrong being an entertainer. That's it's a good thing too. But it's not, that's, it's not like, I think their interests and incentives are different. I mean, they're, I don't think, it's like when somebody, I think that's a little different than, say, a politician to think about their incentives, what it is their goals are, what it is they're doing. And I'm not saying that's even as a bad thing, right? Like they don't have the same pressures to compromise, for example.
Well, you exist in the same arena. You exist in the same arena as these entertainers.
I'm an entertainer too.
You're trying to spread your message. So, I mean, I do consider these people allies. I think it's important to call them out and push back if you're going to be a force on the left. It is a much bigger tent on the left than it is on the right these days. But as long as people like the people you mentioned, Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, fucking Gates, although I don't know how much of a political future he has after this, but then again, he's a Republican. They don't really experience consequences, so who knows where that one's going. As long as we have this sort of like creeping fascism over here, that is a legitimate threat. When you have people like Tom Cotton writing an op-ed for whatever it was, the Wall Street Journal, saying we need to send in the tanks and send in the guns and start shooting people, basically. Then I think at the end of the day, even after you criticize people that maybe aligned with you on many issues, but maybe you feel like their messaging isn't that great, it is important to recognize that in the face of this over here, there needs to be some kind of solidarity over here, just some.
Yeah, for sure. I'll gladly work with the Soviet army to defeat the Nazis. Gladly, not to say that, I'm just being a little facetious there. No, I agree. It's important to beyond that to recognize that on a lot of issues like on a lot of issues like criminal justice, right? I don't agree with the idea of defund the police. But, I mean, if you're out there raising awareness of the problems with our criminal justice system, well, that does some good. I mean, I hope that it doesn't, I guess this gets back to the messaging point. I hope that the messaging of like defund the police doesn't do more harm to the cause of police reform than, say, the benefit that is done by talking about these problems. I kind of doubt that the messaging does more harm, but I really don't know. Maybe you're more aware of that than I am, but.
I'd have to find you the article, but I think at this point we do have data that shows that we lost more than a few House seats in 2020 because Republicans really hammered the Democratic candidate or incumbent about defund the police, and the right wingers in this country did a really good job of marrying the Democratic Party to that movement, even though the leaders of the Democratic Party were doing everything they could to put distance between themselves and that movement. It didn't work, and the Republican messaging was really effective. And so, unfortunately, I think it did do some harm. At the same time, I get why people are angry. Like I was telling the chat before you got here, I chanted those words in the street, and it felt empowering, and it felt good, and that kind of thing. But that's me marching down like Hollywood Avenue. That's different from me. Being like an actual political force. So I don't know how much damage I did electorally by chanting that like down the street. But
Sure.
However, if you're, a major organization and you're really like committed to that slogan, like you said, you didn't support defunding the police, but do you support redirecting funds to social workers to handle certain calls rather than a militarized police state showing up at your door?
Yeah, as long as people can show that would be a good thing. Yeah, down for that. I'm not like, I don't know. It seems like perhaps one of the things that seems difficult with police departments is it seems like low pay in some police departments has resulted in unions instead being able to provide other benefits like higher job security. So perhaps it would be easier to have better trained police. Perhaps it would be easier to have more turnover with police. It'd be easier to hire good cops if you could pay them more, and then you could perhaps cut on some of that, incredible job security. That means that when somebody, for example, does something that is, horrific, that is caught on camera, well, it's very hard to get rid of them. So maybe that's
going to be a tough sell. That's going to be a tough sell in this climate to give police officers raises.
I'm not, but that also depends, right? Like other, because like the police aren't a national institution, right? They're different on different localities, and I guess what I'm saying is I'm certainly open to the idea. I'm just, I wouldn't say like categorically I'm prepared to say the police should have like less money as an institution. I think though it would certainly be nice, because one thing I learned over this past year that I didn't know was that the police in some cities consume like 40-50% of budget.
Yeah.
And that is a pretty massive municipal expenditure.
Right.
If you want to do other things like, I don't know, you want to build some public housing or whatever, at the local level. So if you could cut some of that police budget a little bit without some kind of negative consequence, or not too negative consequence, I guess, then you'd want to do that. But
okay, so I had somebody in my chat by the name of Tampax, old school mod regular. He asked, can you ask him to expand on his position of open borders?
Yeah, sure. I do want to do the corporate personhood thing at some point. I forgot about that. You asked all these really good questions. I just really am interested in stuff. I've got ADD, so I go in all these different directions.
Okay.
So as far as open borders goes, all of the research that I've ever seen says that immigration to the United States of America, I can only speak for the United States, immigration to the United States of America benefits, on the whole, everybody in the country, with the exception, occasionally, of people who have no high school diploma. Otherwise, the economic benefits of immigration with respect to more economic activity, economic growth, and this is including the costs of things like services that are provided, government services that are provided, and yet, to people who are not paying income taxes because they're illegal immigrants, right? Even counting that loss. Even counting the losses that come with illegal immigration, people being paid under the table and not taxed, still provides net benefit, right? And of course, there's all the benefits that come from immigration. Otherwise, people come here and start businesses, things like that. So there's lots of good things. All the problems seem to result from or at least almost all the problems seem to result from our refusal to let immigrants in legally. And so we get things like, say, an immigrant comes here and works for a substandard wage in miserable conditions, and what can they do? Even though this is illegal, they can't do anything because they've already broken the law when they come here. And so when we call the police, they're at very real risk of being deported. So they can't complain about a minimum wage violation or health and safety violation or whatever, right? So it seems to me that given the economic benefits of immigration, we really don't have, and the fact that we could use a piece of those economic benefits to compensate those people who lose out, who may lose their jobs as a result of immigration, to help those people without high school diplomas to get high school diplomas, to get more education. We can help those people with some of this economic gains. So why don't we just do that? Why don't we just let people into the United States to live and work here in the way that we did, say, right up to, until the 1880s, we had relatively few laws on immigration. The first big set of laws we had on immigration were the Chinese Exclusion Acts of the 1880s. Yep. And then in the 1920s, I think we implemented some more draconian laws on Europeans, or not on Europeans, I think on people around the world, all kinds of quotas.
And I was just talking to Mike about this, and I think there was a period post World War II where we really tightened the border with Mexico. We used to have an agreement with Mexico where they could do seasonal work, like people could come up here, do work for a few months, come back. Then they tightened the borders and incentivized people to stay and plant their roots here because they didn't want to keep making that dangerous trek back and forth and then risk getting caught, deported, incarcerated, or whatever. And then, ironically, the tightening our border ended up leading us to a place where it increased illegal immigration. It didn't help the problem whatsoever.
So, absolutely. I mean, it's like
people want what they can't have.
When I'm talking about unintended consequences, this is kind of one of the, this is a good example. And unintended consequences shouldn't be used to just defeat any idea, right? But I think they should at least be considered. So what you raise there is an idea that, totally makes sense. Like if you come here to make money and you want to take that money home to your family, right? But you now can't get back into the country as easily if you leave, then of course you're going to send it, wire the money or whatever. Right. You stay here and work because you want to help your family. And it's weird because it's who benefits from this, really? I mean, we know that the economic consequences for the country are less economic activity. We know that people are still immigrating illegally because the economic situation is so good comparatively. So, the only, I guess, what immigration debates are frustrating about is once we talk about, say, those people without high school diplomas who lose out, that's the one group that the research seems to show. I can't say they all benefit.
But I think it's a marginal difference in wages, right? We're talking about low skilled people without college with just a high school education, maybe no high school education. These people do see a slight depression.
All right, here's the deal. I gotta go to the bathroom anyways. Plus, it is about 9:30. Been a super active stream. I don't know if you can hear me, but Emperor Pout, I see you. Thank you for lurking. I might be back on tomorrow. We'll see.